Hello, everyone, and welcome to our book launch this evening. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Jasmine. I'm from Cacanet Press, and I'm just going to run over what's going to happen this evening. Of course, we're here together to launch the new translation of Nelly Sachs, this huge book as a Carcanet classic, approximatively translated by Andrew Shanks, who is of course here and is going to read for us very shortly, but I'm just going to run over the running order and point you in all the directions of the Zoom room before we get going. So this evening we'll be together for about an hour. Please do see if you can find the chat box. I can see some of you have already. Say hello to us in there. Let us know where you're watching from. We like to read your messages throughout the event and let us know what you think of the reading and the poems. Please make sure when you're using the chat that you select everyone on the drop-down menu, otherwise we won't be able to see each other's messages. It's not the default setting for some reason, so just bear that in mind. Now, while Andrew is reading us the poems, I'm going to have the text up on screen for you as a visual guide. You are still in control of your own screen, so if you need to change the way things look, just have a play around and you should be able to do that. If you have any technical problems throughout the course of the next hour, just put those in the chat as well, and I'll do my best to help you while we're going through the event. Thank you all very much for paying your £2 to be here. We really appreciate that. You may be able to see that I've put the link and the discount code in the chat for you already, but that'll also come as an email tomorrow, so we can do all that later or at the end of the event as well. So I mean, I think there's not that much important stuff to say to you. The important thing to say is that we're joined also by Rachel Mann, which I'm very excited about. Rachel is an Anglican parish priest and she's also a writer. She's written 7 books, including Fierce Imaginings, The Great War, Ritual, Memory and God, which came out in 2017. And her first collection of poetry, A Kingdom of Love, was published by us in 2019. And even more excitingly, her next collection of poetry, sorry, I can't get my words out this evening. Eleanor Among the Saints is coming out in January, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But without further ado, I will invite her on screen to join me so that we can get going with our event. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Jazz. It is a real joy to be here for this launch this evening. It's always a pleasure to introduce someone who's gifted, thoughtful, and talented. It's an even greater pleasure when such a person is a friend. I've had the privilege of knowing Andrew Shanks for, gosh, about 15 years ago. Andrew was for 10 years canon theologian at Manchester Cathedral, and that was the time during which we became friends, and indeed he invited me to be a poet in residence at the cathedral for much of that time. Andrew is one of the rare individuals who is as comfortable talking philosophy and theology as he is talking poetry and prose. He simply is one of the brightest, warmest, and kindest people I know. The book which we are launching tonight, which he very modestly describes as approximately translated by himself, is Revelation Freshly Erupting, the collected poetry of Nelly Sachs. And as we shall hear, Sachs is rightly considered one of the most significant figures in 20th century world literature. The notes on the back say, Sachs' poetry begins as a monumental lament for the victims of the Holocaust. But there are many other themes, including biblical, Kabbalist, and religious allusions, reflections on personal bereavement and mental breakdown. And in such a timely way, There are reflections on poetic vocation in the darkness of recent history, reflections which echo, resonate in our present. So would you please welcome Andrew Shanks?
I'm going to start by reading some poems. This first one belongs to a sequence entitled Prayers for the Dead Bridegroom. Nelly Sachs became a great poet in her 50s. This sequence marks the beginning of her, so to speak, canonical work, and it dates from some time in 1943 to 1944. As German Jews, she and her mother had escaped from Berlin to Stockholm pretty much at the last possible moment in May 1940. You might wonder who the dead bridegroom is who's addressed in this poem. He was a real person, but we don't know his name. Sachs forever kept it secret. All we know is that when she was 17, she'd met and catastrophically fallen in love with an older man, an impossible relationship. She'd nearly died of anorexia in the aftermath. And then 3 decades later, in the 1930s, she seems to have met the man again. And as a political opponent of the Nazis, he'd been one of their early victims. His anonymity helps render him a representative figure. This little poem, written whilst just over the water, the genocide was still proceeding, illustrates the outraged, raw tenderness of Sacks's early work. If I only knew on what you last looked, was it a stone, some stony eye, blind drunk already from having returned so many last looks? Or earth, a shoe's freight of dust? Or black mud churned up by so much parting, so much slithering death? Or was it your last way, wishing you a fond farewell from all the ways you'd ever walked before? A puddle maybe, a reflective glint of metal, the belt buckle of your enemy, some such little fortune teller, eloquent of heaven? Or did this earth, ever loving to those who are leaving, send through the air a bird sign, addressed in that inferno of flesh to your still flickering soul? And next, by way of contrast, I'm going to read a little poem written in the mid-1960s after her style had evolved. To understand this, you need to know that the city of Ur, where we read in Genesis, the patriarch Abraham was born and from which he circuitously emigrated to the Holy Land, is a regular symbol of totalitarianism in Sacks's work. Except that here it represents a much milder, a child's play version of totalitarianism, much milder than the fully developed 20th century form. There are some white ribbons in this poem. I think they're moonbeams. The local deity of Ur was Nana, a moon god. And then there's a picture of a mother. I think the Shekhinah, the divine feminine principle in Kabbalist tradition, the spirit of poetic religious truth. These millennia, puffed up and ever circling round some angry catchword, fresh from the beehive of the sun, second after stinging second, swarm aggression, secret torture. Never even such a little breathing space as once in Ur, where childishness would tug white ribbons in its games of sleep ball with the moon. Along the street, a woman runs at breakneck speed, imploring medication for her infant child. Vowels and consonants cry out in every language. Help. These translations of mine have the title Revelation Freshly Erupting. Originally, I was simply going to call the book Nelly Sachs' Collected Poetry. Revelation Freshly Erupting was just the title of my introductory essay. The idea of transferring that title to the whole came from Carcanet. I'm very happy with it. Whether Nelly Sachs herself would have approved, I've no idea. The phrase itself doesn't come from her, but the idea does, as for instance, in this poem of 1960. Primeval night, and all our messages are piled up on the exile bonfire, yet in vain. For love's alight amidst the thorns and leaps in lashing martyr flames to kiss the unseen heights of heaven with a song. The cave walls stage their shadow show. The air's uneasy with a breeze that tugs the threatening noose and prays. Just wait until the desert-roasted alphabet is made a food for saintly mouths once more. Just wait until we have prophetic guides again to read the lava flows of love and trace the outcrops of its very first and fieriest eruption. There on the page that dying sings, the Word was with God. The Word, my love, the Word was. In Sats's original text of that poem, the allusion at the end there is to the opening verse of Genesis. I've adapted it mainly for the sake of the rhythm, to fit the opening verse of the Gospel of John instead. In general, these translations are quite free. Sachs herself was never part of any religious congregation, either Jewish or Christian, but she draws on both traditions. And next, here is another volcanic poem, this one deploying typically Kabbalist imagery to celebrate the great 13th century Kabbalist classic, the Zohar. His pen, his scalpel cut. The writer of the Zohar surgically drew blood, pulsing from the unseen circulation of the stars, gathered in a cup, the words, the homesick sparks. The grave split open and the alphabet arose. Each letter was an angel, each a crystal shard. Each held refracted droplets dating from creation. These then sang. And there within glowed ruby, jacinth, lapis lazuli, so many scattered seedlings not yet stone. And night, the blackest tiger, roared, and wounded day lay writhing there in pools of light. The shining was a mouth tight shut. An aura only showed God hid within the soul. That's Sachs describing the sort of poetry that she herself wanted to write. What originally attracted me to her work was its prophetic quality. Not prophetic in the sense of making predictions, she doesn't, but in the sense of being revelatory, freshly evoking the sacred. In the whole of 20th century literature, I know of no other writer so authentically prophetic. Here's a poem of 1946, which begins, "Say the prophets came." Say the prophets came, knocking on the doors of night, heads wreathed in horror, circled by the phantom zodiac of demon gods. The secrets of the mutant sky weighed rocking on their shoulders. Came to those who'd long since fled in panic. Say the prophets came and hammered on the doors of night, pathways of the stars engraved in shining gold upon their palms. Came to those long sunk in torpor. Say the prophets came, say they burst swinging through the flimsy doors of night, and then began to slice with sickle words the nodding grain, to harvest starlit dreams of justice for the poor, who'd long ago lost hope and turned aside. Say they exploded through the doors of night in search of fellow listeners to the word. What then, O nettle-tendrilled mass of humankind? What then? Would you attend? Or say the prophets fashioned flutes from slaughtered children's bones? Or say they crammed the air with ash? Or say they piled up high a bridge of sighs, a rainbow message from the veterans of the camps? Oh, you addicted to your petty schemes, what then? Or say the prophets rode upon the thunder in from heaven, smashing through your barricades, and clamored, pleading, warning you, beware lest, by mistake, you leave this world a scorched earth waste. Or say they came and found you in the night, like lovers fearful for their loves. Would you then, night folk, have the loving heart to hear them out? During the 1950s, Sacks's work grows more complex, more folded in on itself, reflecting on the problematic nature of a prophetic vocation like hers in all its ideal ethical infinity. And now I'm going to read you a poem written in 1957, in which she begins by talking to herself about her work as a poet, then switches to addressing God. As you gave birth to these your dust-winged constellation cries of trampled flight, a hand thrust flames into your mouth. O locked-in word of love, great blaze of sun behind the circling night, here in the slipware of my love, I've caught your shining plunge. Yet I am breathless still. Oh, gently counsel these despairing lungs. My light be scoured with all the ocean's wild assault, my sails unfurled to catch the vernal trade wind's energy. Pressed up against the wall in prayer, my every thought becomes a drowning kiss, a golden song seed lodged within some crevice of the barrier reef. In the end, she cracked up. During the 1960s, Sachs spent a considerable length of time being cared for in psychiatric hospitals. My penultimate choice is a poem written in hospital, one of many. The date at the head of this one is the day on which the trial of the infamous Adolf Eichmann began in Jerusalem. It was quite clear from the outset that Eichmann was going to be executed. And indeed, if there was ever a case in which capital punishment was justified, this was surely it. So intransigent, however, was Sachs's abhorrence of capital punishment in general, that she wrote a letter to Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, quixotically petitioning against it, even for Eichmann. The reference to the 36 here is to the tradition that there are in every generation some 36 just men whose existence averts divine wrath, so preserving the world from destruction. The 11th of April, 1961, in grief. Everywhere Jerusalem. Our arrows miss the mark. The truth stays hidden in the quiver. Darkness lingers where the sun should be. The 36 are bowed in toil. Yet now, in transitory retrospect, here's wildfire judgment blazing in the judge's absence. Whereupon clairvoyant sickness issues in a revelation. The crone, the prophetess, is thumping with her staff. Within her craziness lies hidden gold. And now finally, I'm going to read the poem that she chose to recite on the occasion of receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1966, a little poem of exhilaration. She speaks here of the prayer of sand, an image of transfigured mortality, which she says must pass by way of fin to wing. The fish in her poetry is a recurrent symbol of mute suffering, victimhood. The wing of the individual liberated soul then becomes a butterfly, no stranger to the sea, that is, to the immensity of the divine. And then the poem gives us an image of itself as a stone with the fossilized imprint of an insect in it. Collecting fossils was a very popular hobby in the Berlin of Sachs's youth. For the fugitive, what wealth of welcome on the way. Enveloped in the cloth of winds, feet fixed within the prayer of sand, which never reaches its amen, for it must pass by way of fin to wing and then beyond. The ailing butterfly is no stranger to the sea. This stone, inscribed with insect speech, was placed into my hand. Deprived of home, I hold the transformations of the world. And those were the poems that I chose to read. Any questions, any comments?
Thank you, Andrew. Well, before we come to questions from those who are present at the launch, and please, friends, do add your questions either in the chat or ideally in the Q&A section, and I will address them. Before we come to that, Andrew, I hope you don't mind having a bit of a chat with me about some of the things that I've heard in the poetry tonight, but also to, I hope, open up Sachs as a figure for a wider audience as well, because I've always been grateful, Andrew, that you introduced me to Nelly Sachs, that you opened up her poetry to me, an extraordinary poet. Where I'd like to begin is perhaps in a reasonably obvious place, but one which I think is fruitful given many of the themes in Sachs's poetry. Theodor Adorno famously said to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. I mean, to what extent can we offer Sachs as a kind of counter example? And could you speak into how on earth it's possible for her to write poetry in the light and shadow and horror of Auschwitz?
Yeah. Adorno's saying, actually, he wrote this, I think, in the early 1950s, but it became controversial and widely discussed in the late 1950s. And partly because of the response of another poet, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, who was a friend of Nelly Sachs, who precisely pointed to her as an answer to Adorno, and in a way, as an objection to Adorno. And Adorno himself conceded the point that, after all, poetry must still express the anguish. His original saying, I think, was largely a little jab at Heidegger and Heidegger's disciples with their cult of poetry. And of course, Heidegger was deeply involved with the Nazi regime at one point. And some people say right through. In a sense, as Adorno concedes, what else can you do faced with that? Nelly Sachs was jolted. She'd written little things before her exile, but it was the trauma of exile when she was in her 50s that jolted her into writing, and all her work is, in a sense, a response to Auschwitz. At any rate, a response to escaping by the skin of her teeth from that fate.
Yes, and I say, of course, but there may be people who are unaware of this, but Sachs's poetry is written in one sense in counterpoint, but also in relationship with that other poet who wrote in the shadow of Auschwitz, Paul Celan. I'd welcome any thoughts that you have on their relationship, noting, and I spent some time recently with this extraordinary little book of correspondence between them that's both touching and incredibly sharp at times. These are two traumatized people in different kinds of ways, but also people with different kinds of responses to divine. I note this short lyric that Sachs wrote after meeting Celan. We don't know, we don't know, do we, what counts? So perhaps could you speak a little bit into their story, their relationship, and their their differing relationship with the divine and how that perhaps plays out in their poetry.
Yeah, that little phrase is put into a poem by Celan, but remembering meeting Nelly Sachs, and they're words that she spoke. We don't know what counts. Celan's poem makes it clear that their conversation had largely been about her God, and he spoke against him. Celan came from a completely different, they're both Jews, but from a completely different sort of Jewish background from Sachs. He came from a world in, well, it's now in the Ukraine, it was then in Romania, in which Hasidic piety was all around. His family was not extremely pious, but there was a lot of it around. And he responded to the nightmare of Nazism by rejecting religion, by rejecting any comfort, and therefore rejecting Hasidism, but Judaism in general, any faith in God. He came from a religious background and rejected it. Nelly Sachs went in exactly the opposite direction because she was brought up in a completely secular environment. She was one of those Jews who was, in a sense, almost unaware of being Jewish until the Nazi regime taught her that she was. Absolutely non-religious background, completely secular. And she responds to the trauma by going to religion. She doesn't go to religion for comfort. There's absolutely no theodicy in Sachs's work. No justification of God, no answer to Job, nothing like that at all. On the contrary, she goes to religion as a way of doing justice to the sheer blasphemy of Nazism. Finding poetic means to express that revulsion. And so her faith is a way is a form of protest. She never joined a religious community. She never belonged, because that, in a sense, is not what protest required.
I'm going to bring some questioners in. I'm going to read some questions out in a moment, but just one final question from me, Andrew, which I wonder if actually this question relates to what you've just said. I mean, you say in your wonderful essay at the opening of the book, her writing remains in itself a work of resilience, defiantly unsubdued, yet it is energized by pressures that otherwise overwhelmed her. Can you say some more about that, please? What you mean?
Yeah, I think she was always a person of fragile mental health. She had this crisis in her teenage years, in which she nearly died from anorexia because of a failed love affair. She's an extremely sensitive person, and writing her poetry comes out of that personality. In a sense, well, she spent a lot of the 1960s in hospital because of paranoid delusions. And paranoia of her kind is, in a way, the flip side of this sense of vocation, that she should be one to bear witness as a representative. She sees herself as a representative. One of her neighbors in Sweden remarked of her, I think very interestingly, that she was an extremely egocentric person, absolutely not egoistic at all.
Mhm.
Complete egocentricity without any egoism. And she was a sweet-tempered person in a way, but it was about her, to her. And she was, it was probably much better for people's mental health in the immediate aftermath of the absolute horrors of the camps, that people should shrink away and not talk about it, as so many survivors decided not to talk about it, completely silent. It's the same as people who, after the First World War, would not speak about their experience of being in the trenches. Great catastrophes like that, probably in mental health terms, in the immediate aftermath, it is better not to speak. At any rate.
And yet,
yeah.
And yet she bears witness, and one of the words which means witness, if memory serves, is martyr. That's a meaning of the word martyr, is witness. And yet, I mean, can we call her therefore a martyr to this exposure to reality and this determination to bear witness to reality through making?
I think one could call her a martyr. Her illness in the 1960s was very extreme at times. They gave her electric shocks. It relieved the immediate crisis, but she spent a lot of the 1960s in hospital. A destroyed person, a wrecked person, a martyr in that sense. Yes.
Let's bring. Oh, sorry, carry, Andrew, please finish your sentence.
Yeah.
Let's bring in some questions. And there are several which refer to the approximation and the approximative translation. So Karen Leader asked, what was the principle of your process of approximation? What would have been different if you thought of these translated? And Karen says, I don't have the German in front of me listening now.
When she received the Nobel Prize, there were a lot of translations done in English. And after that, she was forgotten about in the English-speaking world, pretty much. So there are those earlier translations. And the reason why they didn't succeed, as it were, in establishing her reputation in the English-speaking world is, I think, that the translators were quite modest in their ambition, which was to render Sachs's German into an English that is very close to that German, and therefore doesn't feel natural as English. I have tried to do something completely different, which is to write poems that, to my ear, at any rate, sound as if they could have been written in English, originally even, but natural, that are proper English poems, English language poems. And that does involve, on occasion, departing a bit from what Sachs's German suggests. I've tried hard not to lose much and to have some justification in her text for pretty well everything that I've put in mine. But it's a very different ambition from that of the earlier translators, to whom I am very, very grateful, because my German is actually not that good. And I started translating her originally with no thought of publication 40 years ago, simply because I couldn't read them in German fluently enough. And therefore, to have translations that gave me a direct clue as to what the actual original German, word by word, meant, was very helpful. They were just what I needed. But
well, no, go on.
Yeah, but they don't work as English poems. It seems to me.
Well, in relation to that, and forgive me if I my terrible pronunciation, Jean Wasbert asks, I found your approximative translations utterly beautiful. Were you consciously making Sachs more accessible, more readable than she was in her original, dare I now add, and in previous translations?
As I say, translations, yes, but Sachs herself is not obscure. I don't think she's an obscure poet. She's a very mysterious poet, but her German is accessible.
A little bit more about the mystery, Andrew.
Yeah, she herself calls her later poetry riddles, and they're riddles which don't have, as it were, a solution. But they're riddles, they're puzzling, they're mysterious, because the immediate occasion has been taken away. They don't explain what their context. That's not always the case, but most of these riddle poems, you can't. She doesn't give you any clue as to what's happening as she writes this. It's the poem is 2 or 3 removes from the immediate experience.
I wonder if that answer relates to David G's question. He says, you say that Nelly Sachs was writing entirely in response to the Holocaust, though she seems to have been writing forward too, for us now, as prophets do. Could you sort of comment on that before perhaps we go into part 2 of that question?
Yes. So I've said that everything in her poetry, insofar as it coheres together, it's because of its origins in the experience of exile. There are 1 or 2 poems which depart a bit from that. There's one in which she mostly she writes with allusions to Jewish religious tradition and Christian religious tradition, but just occasionally she alludes to Buddhist religious tradition, and that's generally connected with Tibet and with the Chinese invasion of Tibet in the late 1950s. There are 1 or 2 other examples in which she's going right beyond the context of the Holocaust. But really, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, and I quote this at the beginning of the collection, he remarked that her poetry, in effect, constitutes 1 book, and that book is the evolution of her response to trauma. As for the future, relevance to the future, she certainly sees herself as a poet who's uttering warnings.
And in that regard, this part 2 of David's question, what are we most essentially being given in her poems, which we need to hear, which you think we need to hear?
Yeah, she's not directly a political poet, although she is a profoundly political poet in another sense. But the political thrust all prophecy has a political thrust. The political thrust of her poetry is as with the finest prophecy, to alert us to the sheer blasphemy. I've said that before, but to the sheer blasphemy of Nazism in the first instance, but of anything remotely resembling Nazism, and of any response to Nazism which is driven by a spirit of resentment and will to revenge. In view of what's happening at the moment in Gaza, she's relevant, I think. She would have been outraged. Her politics, I think, were most closely akin to those of Martin Buber in the Zionist context. At the time of the establishment of the Jewish state in 1948, she wrote a series of poems celebrating beautifully the Holy Land and the return of its people. So she was a Zionist, as was Martin Buber. But these are Zionists of the most removed from militarism. She represents that quite concretely.
And very evidently, I mean, I appreciate we're not talking about militarism as such, but her specific response to the trial of Eichmann and the introduction of the 36 just men. I mean, as say, ever there were a human being who might just about justify capital punishment, it was he. And yet, so there's clearly this thread of treating with reality, but seeking to dwell in the possibility of reconciliation, or is that saying too much?
Now, yes, there is a problem. So Sachs first became famous and to the point that she received the Nobel Prize, but she first became famous by being read and applauded by a generation of young poets in Germany from the late 1950s onwards, who were looking for a reckoning with their father's generation and with the Nazi crimes. And she, to them, often represented someone who offered some prospect of forgiveness, or not forgiveness of the crimes, but of some prospect of renewed openness from a Jewish person towards Germans. It was a need of the moment for that generation to be affirmed in their struggle with their parents. It's probably too confining a context in which to see her. She's not a poet of reconciliation in that sense. Or she is, but it's possible to overdo that interpretation.
I'm hearing something about provisionality here, that, I mean, reconciliation has this sort of determinative, directive focus that this is where we're heading. And I'm hearing something a little more precarious and just the possibility for openness. But yeah. Anyway, this is a conversation. It's probably not for this occasion to really get into that. Let's go back to we've got a number of other questions that perhaps take us in a slightly different direction in the short period of time we've got left now. So Michael Schmidt wants to have a look a little bit closer at your title. He says your title is puzzling semantically. The three words relate in such odd ways. Can you talk us through the title that has been chosen?
Ah, yes. Revelation freshly erupting. Well, Revelation erupts, doesn't it? It's a volcano. It erupted for the first time in the 8th century BCE in the work of the prophet Amos, who was the first writing prophet, and who is a prophet of incandescent rage against the rich. The rich in Amos's world were probably no worse than the rich generally are. But what's fantastically new about Amos is that here is for the first time a God who says, don't flatter me. Take away your worship. What I want is justice. Justice and righteousness. And he says it with this rage. And that is the moment where suddenly the Jewish religion breaks away completely in kind from all other cults, sacred cults around. Because everybody knew about gods. What do they want? They want flattery. They want worship. They want people to give them sacrifice. But above all, to sing their praises. And this God, they seek to please these other gods. But this God seeks absolutely not. He makes no promises of any help or aid, or to beat their enemies for them, or to give them good, fine crops. No, he promises only disaster. Disaster, because that's all they deserve, because they've been unjust, these rich people. And I remember how I got onto this, but
so
Revelation
in the 8th century BCE, we have Revelation, but this is in Sachs's case, freshly erupting.
So I as a theologian, I use the concept, the Amos impulse, as something that recurs throughout the tradition and is extremely difficult for establishments, institutions to accommodate because it's so turbulent. And politically, Amos gives you no particular goal round, no program, no party political program around which to rally. He just gives you the rage. And how do you accommodate that? But through history, the history of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, this rage, this volcano or this earthquake, it's like a fault line running through earthquakes after earthquake. It recurs. And that's the really interesting thing for a theologian like myself to examine and, in a way, to celebrate, although it's deeply problematic. The tradition is alive because at its heart there is this problem, which is how to accommodate the Amos impulse, which has never been resolved. Since the 8th century BC, we've had this problem, which we are still struggling with. And Nelly Sachs fixes it in the sense that here is another eruption. Here is another earthquake of that moral kind. She's absolutely not an establishment woman. But she's presenting the establishment once again with that absolute intransigent demand for justice, which establishments can't, on the whole, satisfy. But we need to hear it. We need to value it. We need to appropriate it. We need to struggle to accommodate that into the ethos of a church or a synagogue or the ummah, if I'm speaking Islamically.
Indeed. To quote from one of your translations, the inferno of flesh.
Yes.
Would we say that?
Yes. Oh, yes, why not?
I mean, that sort of sense of one of the things that is so evident in Sachs's poetry for me is how fleshly it is, how embodied it is, and yet there is this metaphysical abstract horizon as well, and that they're working in concert, but also sometimes in profound tension. There's an eruption there is an inferno there that perhaps speaks something of what you're talking about there with this Amos impulse.
Yes. And also, she was not an intellectual. She doesn't think in abstract concepts. She thinks entirely in metaphors. And metaphor her poetry is simply a piling up of metaphors. It has no tricks, it has no form, it's free verse, but she piles up the metaphors, and the metaphors are there in order to amplify this prophetic voice, this earthquake, this volcano.
Perhaps that is the best place to land. We've had just coming up to an hour. I'm so tempted, Andrew, to open up yet another front, as it were, of conversation. But can I say thank you for all that you've shared tonight? Thank you for introducing Sachs to me, but also now to a wider audience. And may that revelation continue to freshly erupt off the pages.
Thank you both so much. And congratulations, Andrew. I know this has been like decades and decades in the making. So yeah, it's been great to see you discuss it this evening, and thanks for your beautiful reading. And thank you guys for your fascinating questions. Yeah, you really made this event, so thanks very much. Let me give you the code again. Please do go and buy a copy for yourself. There's the discount code there for you in the chat. It will come as an email tomorrow, so you don't need to do it right away. And as always, get in touch with me if you have any problems getting hold of a copy of the book, and I'll do my best to help you. Please join us again this time next week. We're launching a second collection by Andrew Winowen. That is in the chat for you as well, and all the details are on our website. So that's really everything. So thanks again, you guys, and good night.